You, Dalton's finger jabbed the air inches from Grace's face. A waitress is going to cook for Adrian Moretti. The entire kitchen exploded in laughter. Every chef, every cook, every dishwasher, all of them laughing at the woman in the black apron. 5 decorated chefs had already failed this man. 5 professionals with awards reputations and years of training. And now a waitress was volunteering to cook for the most dangerous, most demanding, most feared man in Chicago, a man who hadn't finished a single meal in 15 years. Grace said nothing. She reached behind her back, untied her apron, folded it once, and picked up a white chef's apron instead. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain that fell on Chicago that Tuesday night was the kind that doesn't ask permission. It came sideways, hard and cold, hammering the tall windows of the Bellmont like it had a personal grudge against the building. Inside the restaurant was all gold light in white linen, the kind of place where a glass of water costs more than most people's lunches, and the silence between courses is treated like a luxury in itself. The Bellmont was Adrian Moretti's restaurant. That part everyone in Chicago knew. What most people didn't know, what the staff whispered about in the break room in the parking lot in hushed voices between orders, was that Adrian Moretti had not eaten inside his own restaurant in 3 years. Not once. He owned the place. He paid the staff. He approved the menu. And he stayed away the way a man stays away from a graveyard where someone he loved is buried. 5 chefs had failed him. 5. Each one highly decorated, each one arriving with confidence and a stack of awards, and each one eventually gone. The first had resigned after 3 weeks, leaving a handwritten note that said only, "I cannot cook for a man who does not wish to be fed." The second had been dismissed after Adrian's security team found him cutting corners with the supplier list, something Adrian considered not just a professional failure, but a personal insult. The third had lasted almost 2 months before Adrian sent back a plate of rack of lamb without touching it, looked the man in the eye through his security monitor, and simply said no. The fourth had quit the morning after Adrian refused to acknowledge that a 7-course tasting menu, prepared over 14 hours, had ever been placed in front of him. The fifth had cried, actually cried in the middle of service, and walked out with his knife still on the cutting board. 5 men, 5 failures. And the rumors that circulated through Chicago's restaurant world were dark and growing darker by the month. Some people said Adrian Moretti simply didn't eat, that he survived on something other than food power, fear, the loyalty of dangerous men. Others said he was testing his chefs, deliberately looking for someone loyal enough to be trusted with something more than cooking. A few people, the ones who had worked at the Bellmont long enough to know better, said the truth was simpler and sadder than any of the stories. Adrian Moretti was afraid of food. Not the way a person is afraid of something they can name and describe. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of fear that lives in the body before it reaches the mind, the kind that wraps itself around a memory so tightly that the memory and the fear become the same thing. 15 years earlier, Adrian had been 24 years old and sitting at a banquet table with his family when his mother, Elena Moretti, had reached across the table for a piece of bread and then stopped. Just stopped. Her hand stayed in the air for a moment that lasted forever, and then she'd folded forward, and the screaming had begun, and Adrian had moved toward her too slowly, always too slowly in his memory, and she had died before the ambulance arrived. The doctors said it was the seafood. Contaminated, they said. Poisoned, Adrian's father had said, and he had said it like a man who already knew who to blame. A kitchen assistant, a young woman named Vivian LeBlanc, who had been working the banquet that night and who had disappeared before anyone could question her. Adrian's father had called her a murderer. He had sent men to find her. They never did. And in the absence of answers, the story hardened into the shape of fact. Vivian LeBlanc had killed Elena Moretti. Adrian had grown up with that story. He had inherited it the way he inherited the restaurant, the business, the reputation. And along with it, he had inherited this: every meal, every plate, every single thing placed in front of him carried the possibility of death. Food was not comfort. Food was not pleasure. Food was the thing that had taken his mother from him, and so food had to be controlled, approved, inspected. His supplier list was locked. His private physician reviewed ingredients. A professional taster sat at a small table just outside his dining room, and nothing passed through without first passing through that man's stomach. He ate to stay alive. He had not tasted anything in 15 years. That Tuesday night, with the rain coming down and the city disappearing behind curtains of water, Adrian Moretti had called the Bellmont and said he would be coming in to dine. The call had hit at executive chef Raymond Dalton like a lightning strike. He had 47 minutes. And he had an approved French menu white truffle risotto, seared foie gras, a Wagyu beef tenderloin with a sauce that took 3 days to reduce. He had everything prepared, everything authorized, everything arranged. He had been executive chef for 8 months, and he had not yet cooked for Adrian, and tonight was supposed to be his night. His chance. The meal that would secure his position and silence every competitor who'd whispered that he wasn't good enough for this kitchen. And then 41 minutes before Adrian's arrival, Raymond Dalton had collapsed. It happened fast. One moment he was tasting the sauce, and the next he was bent over the prep sink, his face the color of old ash sweating through his chef's whites. The kitchen went silent. His sous chef called an ambulance. Someone helped him to the medical room. And then everyone turned and looked at each other, and nobody said anything, because nobody wanted to say the thing that was true, that someone had to cook for Adrian Moretti, and none of them wanted to be the one. The sous chef said he wouldn't do it, not without a senior chef present. The line cooks shook their heads and looked at their shoes. A young cook named Marcus actually pulled out his phone like he was considering calling in sick at that exact moment, which would have been almost funny if the situation hadn't been so terrifying. Grace Bennett was standing at the edge of the kitchen. She had been there the whole time, finishing her pre-service side work, rolling silverware at the corner station, the way she did every single night before the dining room opened. She was 31 years old, and she had been a waitress at the Bellmont for 3 years. She wore the black uniform with the gold trim, and she knew the menu by heart, not just the names of the dishes, but how they were made, what wine paired with what course, which ingredients came from which supplier. She knew because she paid attention, and she had always paid attention even when nobody was paying attention to her. She set down her silverware. She looked at the kitchen, at the paralyzed sous chef, at the cooks who had suddenly discovered very important things to stare at on the floor, at the untouched prep stations, and the cooling sauces and the clock on the wall showing 38 minutes. And she said quietly and clearly, "I can cook for him." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then the laughter started. It came from everywhere at once. The line cooks, the prep staff, the dishwashers, who had no business laughing at anything, but couldn't help themselves. Someone actually slapped the counter. A young cook named Derek laughed so hard he had to put down his knife. From the medical room through the open door, Raymond Dalton's voice came out thin and mean and absolutely certain. "She's a server. She belongs in the dining room. Someone get me my sous chef on the phone." Grace didn't look at Derek. She didn't look at the laughing cooks or the shaking heads or the sous chef who was already dialing his phone. She looked at the clock, 37 minutes. She reached behind her back and untied her black waitress apron. She folded it once neatly and placed it on the counter beside the silverware she'd been rolling. Then she walked to the chef's locker in the corner of the kitchen, the spare one, the one nobody used because it held backup supplies and forgotten equipment, and she took out a white chef's apron and tied it around her waist. The laughter in the kitchen began to thin out the way laughter does when it starts to realize it might be wrong. "Who's going to authorize this?" the sous chef said. "Nobody authorized this. She cannot." "Call upstairs," Grace said, already moving to the walk-in cooler. "While you're calling, I'm cooking." She stood in the walk-in for 30 seconds, very still, looking at what was available. The approved luxury ingredients were all there, the Wagyu, the truffle, the foie gras. She looked at them the way you look at things that are technically available but wrong for the moment. Then she moved deeper into the cooler, to the back shelf where the prep work supplies were stored. Beef bones, oxtail, brown and meaty and humble, the kind of thing that most high-end kitchens consider beneath serving, but keep around because good stock starts with bones. She carried the oxtail to the counter. She found onions, peppers, garlic. And then she went to her locker, the waitstaff locker, not the kitchen one, and she came back carrying a small metal box. Old, dented at the corners. The kind of box that had been handled so many times its surface had gone soft. She opened it on the prep counter, and inside were small glass jars of spices, each one labeled in small, careful handwriting, and a folded piece of paper worn thin at the creases. A recipe, handwritten, someone else's handwriting, not Grace's. "What is that?" one of the line cooks said, coming closer despite himself. None of your business, Grace said and turned on the burner. She started with the bones because good oxtail starts with patience and patience starts with the bones. She roasted them first dry heat until the edges turned deep brown and the fat began to render, and that first smell rose from the pan and moved through the kitchen like a conversation nobody had expected to hear. It was rich and dark and complicated, the smell of something that knew what it was. The sous chef was still on his phone. Derek had stopped laughing. The young cook named Isabel Cruz, who had worked the prep station for 7 months and had never once been asked her opinion about anything, drifted close to Grace's station and watched her hands. Grace moved with a quietness that was different from the noise of the kitchen. She wasn't performing. She wasn't demonstrating. She was cooking the way some people pray, with her full attention, with the certainty of someone who learned from a person who knew that food is not about ingredients or technique or presentation. Food is about the person you're feeding and what they need. She added the oxtail to the bones, seared it hard on all sides until the surface was deeply caramelized. She built her aromatics, onion, garlic, peppers, slow in the same pan, letting them soften and absorb what the meat had left behind. She added spice from the small jars in the metal box, each one measured not with a spoon, but with her fingers, with the certainty of muscle memory. "You went to culinary school?" Isabel asked, because she couldn't not ask. "No," Grace said. "Then who taught you?" Grace didn't answer right away. She added the bones back to the pot, covered everything with stock, reduced the heat, and then she looked at Isabel. "An old woman," she said, "the best cook I ever saw. She taught me everything she knew." "Where is she now?" "She passed," Grace said, "about 2 years ago." She said it simply, without sentiment, the way you talk about someone whose loss you've learned to carry instead of put down. The kitchen had gone almost entirely quiet now. The sous chef had ended his call. He stood near the pass, arms crossed, watching Grace work. He didn't say anything else about authorization. He didn't say anything at all. 18 minutes before Adrian's arrival, the stew was simmering. 22 minutes and the aroma had moved from the kitchen through the pass and into the dining room, and Claudette, the front of house manager, had come through the door to see what was happening. She stood at the edge of the kitchen and breathed it in, and her face did something complicated in private before she got it under control. "That smells like my grandmother's house," she said to nobody in particular. "I know," said Isabel. Grace ladled the stew into a bowl, not a plate, a bowl, deep and wide white ceramic, the kind of bowl that holds warmth. She plated it simply, a piece of the oxtail on top, a small pile of rice on the side, a scattering of fresh herbs from the garde-manger station. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to the sous chef. "This goes upstairs," she said. "You're serious," he said. "I've been serious this whole time," she said. The sous chef looked at the bowl. He looked at the clock. He looked at Grace. Then he called upstairs and told them a dish was coming. The reaction from Adrian's security team was immediate and not warm. Lucas Shaw, Adrian's head of security, a man built like a wall and trusted like one, appeared in the kitchen doorway in under 4 minutes, which was impressive considering the distance from the private elevator to the kitchen. He looked at Grace. He looked at the bowl. He looked at Grace again. "This is not on the approved supplier list," he said. "No," Grace agreed. "The ingredients haven't been verified. The spices are mine. Everything else came from your approved cooler." "She's right," the sous chef said, and he sounded surprised to hear himself say it. Lucas Shaw studied the bowl for a long moment. "Mr. Moretti's taster needs to—" "Then take it upstairs," Grace said, "and let the taster do his job." Lucas picked up the bowl with both hands, looked at it like he was trying to find something wrong with it, and carried it to the elevator. In the private dining room on the 32nd floor, Adrian Moretti sat at a table by himself. He was 40 years old, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long, he had forgotten what his posture felt like without it. He wore a dark suit with no tie, and there was a glass of water in front of him that he had not touched. He was looking at the rain on the window when Lucas came in. The taster, a quiet man named Howard, who had held the position for 6 years without incident, took a spoonful from the bowl. He waited the required 10 minutes standing at the side table and then nodded. No reaction. Clean. Lucas placed the bowl in front of Adrian. The aroma hit him before the bowl was set down. Adrian's hand, which had been resting flat on the table, went very still. Something moved across his face, not a recognizable expression, more like the shadow of one, the echo of something that had happened a long time ago in a different life. He sat with the bowl in front of him for almost a full minute without touching it. Lucas said, "The cook is not Chef Dalton, sir. Dalton became ill before service. The woman who prepared this is a member of the waitstaff." Adrian looked up. "A waitress cooked this." "Yes, sir." Another silence. Adrian looked at the bowl again. The oxtail sat in a deep, dark broth, the kind of broth that only comes from hours of coaxing flavors, from things that have no glamour but carry tremendous depth. The rice was simple and white beside it. The herbs were green and bright. It was the kind of meal that didn't apologize for what it was. He picked up the spoon. He took one taste. The room, which was already quiet, went quieter, in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with what happened to Adrian's face. His jaw loosened slightly. His eyes, which had been flat and careful since he'd arrived, shifted not dramatically, not in any way that Lucas could have fully described if asked, but shifted the way a locked door shifts when the right key finds it. I was in his mother's kitchen. He was 12 years old. He was sitting at the small wooden table with the uneven leg that his father kept meaning to fix and never did. And Elena was at the stove with her back to him, humming something wordless, and the smell filling the room was exactly this smell. This deep, impatient, and honest smell, and he had not been afraid of anything yet. The spoon went back to the bowl, and then again, and again. 15 minutes later, the bowl was empty. In all the years that Howard had served as Adrian's taster, he had never seen the bowl come back empty. He had seen plates returned half-finished, or barely touched, or sent back without comment. He had never seen this. Adrian looked at the empty bowl for a moment. Then he said to Lucas very quietly, "Bring me the cook." In the kitchen, when Lucas's call came through, the reaction was mixed. The sous chef looked relieved and terrified in equal measure. Isabel made a small involuntary sound that might have been a gasp. Derek, the cook, who had laughed loudest, turned away and pretended to be very busy with something at his station. Grace was cleaning her workstation. She was scrubbing the cutting board with methodical strokes the way her mentor had taught her. Always clean your space, the kitchen before yourself, the tools before you rest. She looked at her phone when the sous chef passed it to her and read the message from upstairs. She removed her white chef's apron, folded it the same way she had folded the black one, and placed it on the counter beside the first. Then she took the elevator up. The 32nd floor was different from the rest of the building. It was quieter and cooler, and the carpet was thicker, and the art on the walls looked like it meant something specific to someone. Grace walked with Lucas behind her and two other men she didn't know in front, and they stopped outside a set of dark wood doors. She had been a waitress for 3 years. She had carried expensive plates to people who never looked at her face. She had memorized wine lists and dietary restrictions and the names of VIP clients. She had done all of this with a careful professional blankness, the armor that people in service learn to wear because the alternative, caring, really caring every day, is too expensive. Standing outside Adrian Moretti's private dining room, she felt no armor. She felt tired and determined and a little frightened in a way she recognized and had learned not to obey. Lucas opened the door. Adrian Moretti was standing when she came in, which surprised her. She had expected him sitting authoritative, the way powerful men arrange themselves when they want to make other people feel small. Instead, he was standing near the window with his hands at his sides, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not angry, not warm, something more complicated than either. He said, "You cooked that." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered it anyway. "I did, without authorization." "There wasn't time for authorization," she said. "There was time to cook." A pause. Adrian looked at the empty bowl on the table still there, as if he hadn't wanted it cleared. "What was in it? Oxtail, beef bones, aromatics, spice." She paused. "A recipe from someone who knew what she was doing." "Your recipe?" "No," she said. "Someone else's." He turned back to her. "Who?" She met his eyes, which were very dark and very careful, and not. She thought the eyes of a man who was actually angry. They were the eyes of a man who was trying to decide whether to be angry, which was different. "That's private," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that could go several ways. Grace was aware of Lucas somewhere behind her left shoulder. She was aware of the rain still coming down on the other side of the window. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was telling her to be careful and which she was largely ignoring. Adrian said, "I could fire you." "You can," Grace said, "but you can't tell me the food was bad." She gestured at the empty bowl on the table. You cleaned it. Every drop. The expression on his face changed just barely, just at the edges, like something cracked slightly and then thought better of it. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. You are very bold for someone who cooked without permission in my kitchen. With respect, Grace said. The alternative was sending you an empty table. I made a judgment call. And if I'd been poisoned, the taster had it first, she said. Same as always. Another pause. Longer this time. Adrian walked back toward the table and stood behind his chair, one hand on the back of it, looking at the bowl. Who trained you, he said, again differently this time. Not like he was demanding, like he actually needed to know. A woman named Vivian, Grace said. She passed 2 years ago. She taught me everything I know about cooking and most of what I know about patience. Something moved through Adrian's expression at the name quick as a shadow. Grace filed it away without knowing why. He said, I want you as my private chef. Grace blinked. Of all the things she had prepared herself for being fired, being questioned, being dismissed back to the dining room. This was not it. Your private chef. 20 times your current salary. You'd cook for me exclusively. No dining room service. Grace's mind went to her father immediately. Frank Bennett, who owed $40,000 to men who did not extend courtesy reminders. Frank, who had borrowed from the wrong people while chasing the wrong luck, and whose debt had been growing like something alive and hostile. 20 times her salary. The number landed in her mind and rearranged everything. She said, I have one condition. Lucas behind her made a small sound of disbelief. Adrian looked at her with an expression that said clearly he was not accustomed to conditions. Go ahead. Grace looked him straight in the eye. Inside my kitchen, nobody decides what I cook except me. Not you, not your security team, not whatever doctor approves your ingredient list. I cook what I know is right, and I answer for it with my name. If that's not acceptable, I'll go back to the dining room. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Adrian studied her for a long time. Long enough that she had to actively resist the urge to look away. She didn't look away. She had learned from Vivian from 3 years of carrying plates, from 31 years of being a woman in spaces that preferred her quiet and agreeable, that looking away first costs you something you can't always get back. Adrian said agreed. Then I accept, Grace said. She turned to leave. Lucas stepped aside without being asked, which she noted. She was at the door when Adrian said behind her, what was her last name? The woman who trained you. Grace stopped. She didn't turn around. LeBlanc, she said. Vivian LeBlanc. She heard nothing from behind her, no reaction, no response. She walked out through the door and back to the elevator. Only when the doors closed did she let herself breathe. Back in the kitchen, the staff had not dispersed. They were all still there, the sous chef, the line cooks Isabel, Derek, Claudette, who had come in from the front of house. They watched her come back through the kitchen door. Well, the sous chef said. Grace picked up her folded waitress apron from the counter. She looked at it for a moment, then she set it back down. I won't be needing this anymore, she said. He fired you, Derek said, and his voice had lost all its laughter. No, Grace said. She picked up the metal spice box and tucked it under her arm. He hired me, private chef. She looked around the kitchen at all of them. I'd like whoever's closest to the stove to turn off the burner under the stock pot, and someone should call Chef Dalton's sous chef. He'll need to handle service tonight. She paused at the door. Isabel. Isabel looked up sharply from where she'd been standing near the garde-manger. Yes, you have good instincts. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Grace held her gaze for one moment. I'll see you tomorrow. She walked out. Behind her, the kitchen stayed quiet for a full 10 seconds, which in a restaurant kitchen before service is practically geological time. And then Isabel Cruz turned back to her station, and something in her posture was different, and the sous chef cleared his throat and service began. On the 32nd floor, Adrian Moretti stood alone with the empty bowl. He picked it up and held it in both hands, which was not something he did. He held it and he breathed in the last of the smell, still rising from the ceramic, faint and darkening, but still there, still holding the ghost of something that had come from a small kitchen in a time before he had learned to be afraid. He thought about the name she'd said, LeBlanc. He set the bowl down carefully. He called Lucas. Find out everything you can about Grace Bennett, he said. Where she came from, her family, her background. He paused. And find out who Vivian LeBlanc was. Lucas said he would. Adrian ended the call and looked at the rain on the window and did not eat the untouched bread, still sitting in its basket on the table. He was not hungry. He was something else, something he hadn't felt clearly enough in 15 years to name it without hesitation. But it felt something like hunger, and something like memory, and something uncomfortably and undeniably like hope. In the kitchen downstairs, the evening service moved forward without a star chef and without disaster. And the bowl that had been carried upstairs sat in the dish return, and the woman who had filled it was already gone, thinking about her father and an old metal spice box in the handwriting of a woman history had decided to forget. She did not know, not yet, that the name she had given Adrian tonight had opened something in him that had been sealed for 15 years. She did not know that the word LeBlanc had landed in his mind the way a key lands when it fits a lock, not with force, not with noise, but with a small and precise and irrevocable click. She did not know that what she had started tonight was not merely a new job. She did not know that the most dangerous thing she had ever done was not walk into that kitchen without permission. It was say that name. Grace Bennett reported to the 32nd floor kitchen at 6 o'clock the following morning. Not because anyone told her to, because she had always believed that the first morning in a new place tells you everything you need to know about whether you belong there or not. The penthouse kitchen was nothing like the restaurant kitchen downstairs. It was quieter, for one thing, cleaner in a way that felt less like cleanliness and more like absence, the absence of warmth, of use, of anyone having stood at those counters and cooked something they actually cared about. The appliances were high-end and cold to the touch. The pantry was organized with a precision that felt almost military, every label facing forward, every container sealed. It was a kitchen that had been maintained without being loved. Grace set her metal spice box on the counter beside the stove. She opened it, arranged the small jars the way Vivian had taught her, most used closest to the hand, everything visible, nothing buried, and then she stood very still for a moment and let the room become familiar with her presence. Then she started cooking breakfast. She found eggs in the refrigerator, good ones, brown and heavy. She found bread that had been delivered that morning, still in its paper wrapping. She found butter. She made scrambled eggs slowly the way Vivian had shown her low heat. Low heat, constant movement, patience, and toasted the bread and brewed coffee from beans. She ground herself. When it was ready, she carried it on a tray to the dining area and left it on the table with a handwritten card that said, "Only breakfast." 7:15 a.m. She went back to the kitchen and cleaned up. She heard Adrian come out of his room at 7:22. She heard him stop when he reached the table. She heard the chair pull back. She did not come out of the kitchen to watch because she understood the way Vivian had taught her to understand that eating is a private act and watching a man eat is a kind of intrusion. 7 minutes later, the tray came back to the kitchen pass. Empty plate, half-drunk coffee, not because it was bad, she decided, but because he was a man who didn't finish his coffee the same way most people don't finish their thoughts. No note, no comment, but the plate was clean, and that was enough. She was back in the main kitchen by 8:30, collecting the day's supplies from the delivery that had arrived at the service entrance. She was checking the crates, a habit Vivian had drilled into her. Always check what you receive, but never assume the delivery matches the order when she found the first one. The bottle of olive oil sat in the middle of the third crate, surrounded by its usual companions, labeled correctly, sealed at the top. Everything about it looked right. Grace picked it up and turned it in her hands the way you turn a thing that's bothering you before you know why it's bothering you. She uncapped it and brought it close. The smell was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that announces itself. It was subtle and undertoned beneath the oil, like something had been added to something that should have been pure. She set the bottle aside and went through the rest of the crate with both hands and her full attention. She brought the bottle to the kitchen manager, a thin, quiet man named George who had worked the supply chain at the Bellmont for 9 years, and who looked at the bottle with the expression of someone who had been hoping not to see something like this. "I need this tested," Grace said. "Tested," George repeated, "by whoever tests things around here. I need to know what's in this oil before it goes anywhere near a stove." George looked at the bottle for a long moment. "I'll have to call Mr. Shaw." "Then call him," Grace said. Lucas Shaw arrived at the kitchen in 11 minutes. He examined the bottle without touching it, then looked at Grace with an expression that she was learning to read, the expression of a man who is recalibrating something. "You noticed this on your own," he said. I check everything I receive, she said. The smell is off. Under the oil, there's something else. I don't know what, but it shouldn't be there. Lucas picked up the bottle with the cloth, sealed it in a bag he produced from his jacket pocket, which told Grace he had come prepared, which told her this was not the first time something like this had happened, and left without another word. The kitchen staff downstairs watched Grace with a range of expressions that morning, and none of them were entirely friendly. She had expected that. She had not expected the speed or the creativity of what Raymond Dalton, speaking from his home, where he was supposedly recovering from his illness, began to do within 48 hours of her promotion. It started small. Ingredient labels switched on her shelves, the salt moved to the sugar container, the cumin placed where the coriander should have been, small enough to be written off as accident. She caught every one of them because she checked everything twice morning and night, same as Vivian had taught her. A good cook, Vivian used to say, never assumes. She confirms. Then the rumors started, the story going around the kitchen, and Grace heard it from Isabel, who heard it from the prep cook, who heard it from someone in the supply room, was that Grace had manipulated Adrian, that she had known Dalton would get sick, that she had positioned herself deliberately to take his place, that the whole thing had been a calculated play from a woman with no real credentials, just the ability to read a room in a very convenient moment. Grace heard the rumors the same way she heard the kitchen noise, constant, present, and mostly ignorable. What mattered was the food, and the food she cooked for Adrian every day was good, because she made it good, because she stood over every pot with the same attention she'd given to that first bowl of oxtail stew, because Vivian had taught her that your reputation in a kitchen is built one dish at a time and destroyed in the same way. Adrian said almost nothing to her directly during those first 10 days. He was not rude, which surprised her. He was not warm either, which didn't. He was careful in the way that people are careful when they are trying to determine whether something is safe, not hostile, but watchful. She noticed he would sometimes stand at the door of the kitchen while she was cooking, just briefly, not long enough to constitute a visit, as if he had come to check on something and then thought better of announcing it. She cooked for him the way Vivian had always told her to cook, not to impress, but to nourish. Roast chicken with herbs and lemons, simple and exact. Handmade bread, the kind that takes 3 hours but asks nothing of you while it's rising except patience. A vegetable soup with beans and whatever was freshest in the delivery. Comfort food, American food, the kind of food that doesn't perform. On the 4th day, he ate everything she prepared. On the 6th day, he asked her through Lucas to change nothing about the menu. On the 9th day, she came into the kitchen at 6 in the morning and found a glass of orange juice sitting on the counter with a note beneath it. The note said, "The bread yesterday was excellent. It was not signed. It didn't need to be." She told no one about the note. She put it in her apron pocket, and at the end of the day, she took it home and placed it inside the metal spice box between 2 of Vivian's recipe cards where it would be safe. Then the second sabotage arrived, and it was not subtle at all. She had ordered a particular blend of dried chili. Vivian's recipe called for it, specifically a combination of 2 types that produced a depth of heat without sharpness from the approved supplier. What arrived was a single variety, aggressively hot, the kind that would overwhelm any dish it touched and leave a man thinking the food had been prepared carelessly, or worse, deliberately. Grace caught it during her morning check. She called the supplier directly, something she was not technically authorized to do, and the supplier told her the substitution had been requested by a senior kitchen staff member. She asked which one. A pause. Then the supplier gave her a name, Paul Mercer, one of the prep cooks who had been at the Bellmont for 6 months and who Grace had noticed watched her with a particular quality of attention that had nothing to do with admiration. She brought this to Lucas, not to Dalton's remaining allies in the kitchen, not to the restaurant manager, not to anyone who might manage it quietly and in a direction she couldn't see. She went directly to Lucas because she had decided early instinctively that Lucas Shaw was the most honest person in Adrian's orbit, which was saying something in an orbit like Adrian's. Lucas listened to her. He asked her to repeat the supplier's name. He said he would look into it. He looked at her with that recalibrating expression again, and she could see him adding something to whatever picture he was building of her. "Why didn't you report the first issue directly to Mr. Moretti?" he said. "Because he has enough to worry about," Grace said. "That's my job. This is yours." A pause. Most people in your position would use every opportunity to get FaceTime with him. Build the relationship. Secure the position. I'm not securing a position, Grace said. I'm cooking. If the food is good enough, the position is already secured. Lucas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once small and definitive, and left. That evening, Grace was cleaning down the kitchen 11 at night, long after Adrian had eaten dinner and retired the building. Mostly quiet when she heard footsteps in the hallway and the door opened, and it was not Lucas, and it was not Adrian. It was Adrian himself in different clothes, no jacket, looking like a man who had been staring at the ceiling of his room for several hours and finally lost the argument with himself about getting up. He stopped in the doorway when he saw she was still there. "You're still here," he said, which was clearly not what he'd planned to say when he opened the door. "Finishing the cleanup," she said. "I'll be out of your way in 10 minutes. He came into the kitchen anyway. He went to the refrigerator, opened it, stood in front of it for a moment without taking anything out. Grace watched him from the corner of her eye and kept wiping down the counter. He said, "Do you always stay this late?" "When there's work to finish," she said. Another silence. He closed the refrigerator without taking anything. He stood at the island counter, one hand on the surface, not quite settled, not quite ready to leave. Grace turned and looked at him directly, not with deference, not with challenge, just straight. "You can't sleep," she said. He didn't deny it. "No, Maison. Sit down," she said. He looked at her. It was the kind of look that could mean several things, and in Adrian Moretti's vocabulary of expressions, she was only beginning to learn which was which. But he sat down at the kitchen island on one of the tall stools with his hands flat on the counter, like a man who is trying to remember how to be somewhere without a purpose. Grace turned on a low burner. She found the leftover beef broth from the afternoon's prep in the refrigerator still warm enough to heat quickly. She found noodles in the pantry, thin, simple ones, nothing elaborate. She cooked them fast 3 minutes and added them to 2 bowls of heated broth with a little green onion and a crack of pepper. She placed one bowl in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her, still standing across the island with her own bowl. "Your taster isn't here," he said. "No," she said. She picked up her spoon, dipped it into his bowl, not hers, his, and took a full spoonful and ate it. She set the spoon down in his bowl. "Now he is," she said. Adrian stared at her. Something in his face went very quiet, the way things go quiet just before they change. He picked up the spoon and ate. They sat in the kitchen together in the middle of the night, eating plain noodle soup in almost total silence. And it was the most ordinary thing that had happened in that penthouse in years, possibly ever. And Adrian Moretti ate every last noodle and did not say a single word about poison or tasters or approved ingredient lists. After a while, he said, "You don't seem afraid of me." "I'm a little afraid of you," Grace said. "I just don't let it run my behavior." A pause. "Most people do." "I know," she said. "I've watched it happen. It doesn't end well for them or for you." He looked at her across the empty bowls. "That's a bold thing to say to a man in my position." "You hired me for honesty," she said. "If that's not what you wanted, the contract needs to be rewritten." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it, just the edge, just for a second before it disappeared. But she caught it and she stored it somewhere the way she stored the note about the bread, in a place where things that mattered were kept. He said, "Tell me about the woman who trained you." Grace was quiet for a moment. She picked up the 2 empty bowls and placed them in the sink and ran water over them. Not because they needed immediate washing, but because she needed a moment to decide how much to say. "Her name was Vivian LeBlanc," she said without turning around. "She was the best cook I ever saw. She could take nothing bones and scraps and the things that other kitchens threw away and make something that made you feel like the world was going to be all right." She paused. She didn't have a restaurant. She didn't have a title. She had a small apartment on the south side and a kitchen she'd been cooking in for 40 years, and she knew more about food than anyone I've ever met who had a wall full of awards. "How did you find her?" "She found me," Grace said, turning back around. "I was 17. I was working a part-time job at a diner near her building to help with my father's bills. She used to come in for coffee on Tuesday mornings, and she always ordered something that wasn't on the menu, and somehow the cook always made it for her." She paused. "One morning I asked her how she did that. She said she just asked clearly and waited patiently. Then she told me I had good hands and offered to teach me what she knew." "Good hands," Adrian said. "She said she could tell by the way I carried things," Grace said. "She said you can see a cook in the way someone handles a cup." He was quiet after that. Not the silence of a man who had run out of things to say, but the silence of a man who was thinking about several things at once. Then he said, "There was a woman at my mother's banquet the night my mother died." He said it without preamble, the way you say things when you've decided to say them before you can stop yourself. She worked in the kitchen. She disappeared afterward. They blamed her. He was looking at the counter. Her name was LeBlanc. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. It had weight. It had direction. It landed between them on the counter like something physical. Grace felt it. She felt the exact shape of it, the way it connected to the notes she'd found in Vivian's recipe book. The cryptic ones written in the margins of the seafood pages in Vivian's small, careful hand. Notes about a banquet. About something going wrong that was not her fault. About a man named Orlov who had no business being in the kitchen, but who was there nonetheless. She did not say this to Adrian. Not yet. Because she needed to understand it herself before she could say it to him, and because she looked at his face and saw the 15-year weight of the story he'd been carrying, and understood that dropping it differently than he expected could break something that might not be fixable. "Did they ever find her?" she said carefully. "No," he said. "My father spent years looking." He finally looked up at her. "I spent some time after that too." Grace held his gaze. "What would you have done if you'd found her?" A long pause, long enough that the refrigerator cycled on and off in the silence. "I don't know," he said, and it was the most honest thing she had heard him say, more honest than anything he'd said about food or business or security, and she recognized it as such. She nodded once and said nothing further on the subject. She picked up her metal spice box from the counter. "I'll see you at 7, she said. He watched her go. She could feel it as she walked to the elevator, the weight of his attention different now from what it had been. Something had shifted the same way a room shifts when a window is opened, not dramatically but enough to change everything about the air. She did not sleep well that night. She lay on her back in her apartment, thinking about Vivian's recipe book and the notes in the margins and the name Orlov, written in pencil on a page about seafood preparation circled twice, as if Vivian had come back to it more than once, and couldn't decide whether to cross it out or underline it. She got up at 4 in the morning and sat at her kitchen table with the book open and a cup of tea she didn't drink, and she read the notes from the beginning again slowly. And this time with the knowledge that the banquet Vivian had written about was the night Elena Moretti had died. The pieces were all there. They had been there for 2 years since Vivian had pressed the book into her hands and said only, "Keep this safe, it matters more than I've told you." Grace had kept it safe without knowing why. She had cooked from its recipes without reading the margins closely enough. She had carried it the way you carry something precious when you don't fully understand its worth. She understood now. She closed the book and held it against her chest in the dark kitchen, and she thought about a woman who had spent 30 years hiding, teaching a young waitress in a South Side apartment building, a life on the ruins of an accusation she couldn't disprove. She thought about what it costs a person to carry innocence no one will accept. She thought about Adrian's face when he said, "I don't know." The honesty in it, the exhaustion. She put the book back in her spice box and went back to bed and lay there until 5:30, and then got up and got dressed and went to work because the food still had to be cooked, and because Vivian had also taught her this. The hardest days are exactly the ones you cannot miss. She arrived at the kitchen at 6 and found Lucas Shaw already there, which was unusual. He was standing at the counter with a folder in his hand and an expression she had not seen on him before, not the recalibrating look, something tighter and more serious. "Sit down," he said. Grace sat on the stool at the kitchen island where Adrian had sat 12 hours ago eating noodle soup. "The oil you flagged," Lucas said. "The lab came back. And highly concentrated, very slow acting, nearly impossible to detect by smell. Under normal circumstances." He paused. "You caught it." "I had better than normal circumstances," she said. "Someone taught me what to look for." "Paul Mercer has been with the restaurant 6 months, Lucas continued. "His employment history before that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. References that don't check out, an address that doesn't exist." He closed the folder. "Someone placed him here." The word landed like a stone in still water, and the rings moved outward from it in every direction. "Someone who wanted access to Adrian's food supply," Grace said. "That's one interpretation," Lucas said. "What's the other?" He looked at her steadily. someone who wanted access to you. The silence was not comfortable. Grace thought about her father, about Frank Bennett, who owed money to people she had never met and who had been sinking deeper into that debt for 2 years, always with a new reason, always with a promise that the next payment would fix it. My father, she said. Lucas nodded. His creditors. We've been looking at the chain. He paused and she could see him making a decision about how much to tell her. The people your father owes money to are connected to a name that keeps appearing in our investigations. A man named Victor Orlov. Grace felt the name hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Victor Orlov. The name from Vivian's book. The name circled in pencil on the seafood page. She kept her face very still. I've heard that name, she said. Lucas's expression sharpened. Where? She stood up. I need to get something, she said. Give me 1 hour. She went to her apartment. It took 20 minutes each way by car, and she did not explain herself to Lucas's offer of a driver, just took her own keys and went, and she came back with the metal spice box. She set it on the kitchen counter. She opened it and removed the recipe book and placed it in front of Lucas. This belonged to my teacher, she said. Read the pages about the seafood. Read the margin notes. Lucas read them. He stood very still while he read the way people stand when they are reading something that rearranges the furniture in their mind. When he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on him before either. Vivian LeBlanc, he said, the woman from the banquet. The woman who was blamed, Grace said, not the woman who did it. Lucas looked at the book again. He looked at the name Orlov circled twice in Vivian's careful pencil. He said, Mr. Moretti needs to see this. I know, Grace said, but I need you to understand something first. She held his gaze. The man she worked for 30 years ago is connected to my father's debt. Someone deliberately pushed my father deeper into that debt. That is not a coincidence. Lucas said nothing. Whoever this is, Grace said, they've been setting this up for longer than I've been in this building. They put Mercer in the kitchen to get to me. They're using my father to control me. And the thing they keep coming back to, she pointed at the book, is this. Mercer was ordered to steal it, which means whoever is running this knows what's in it. Lucas looked at her for a long time. Then he said, you should not have come to this building. No, Grace said, probably not. She picked up the spice box, replaced the book inside it, closed the lid. But I'm here now. She picked up the box and walked to the stove because it was 7 o'clock and breakfast needed to be made and Adrian Moretti needed to eat, and none of what she now knew changed any of that. If anything, it made it more important. She turned on the burner. She began to work. Lucas stood at the kitchen door and watched her for a moment, and then he said quietly, almost to himself, You're a lot of things, Ms. Bennett, but you're not naive. No, Grace said without turning around. I'm not. I had a good teacher. She heard the door close behind him. She cracked the eggs. She worked in the quiet kitchen, her hands moving with the certainty Vivian had given her, her mind holding everything she now knew and sorting it, the way she sorted spices, not to use all at once, but in the right order, at the right moment, for the right purpose. And in the back of her mind, steady and unresolved as a pot left on a low flame, was the understanding that the man who had used Vivian LeBlanc to cover a murder 30 years ago was now using Grace Bennett to finish the job. And he had chosen wrong on both occasions. 3 days passed after Lucas took the recipe book away for documentation, and Grace cooked through every one of them the way she always cooked, with full attention, with both hands, with the part of her mind that stayed calm even when the rest of her was anything but. She made Adrian's breakfast at 7, his lunch at noon, his dinner at 7 in the evening, and each meal she prepared with the knowledge sitting at the bottom of her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. Victor Orlov was real, he was close, and he had been building towards something for a very long time. Adrian did not bring up the recipe book. Lucas had clearly briefed him because she could feel the shift in the way Adrian moved around her, more careful, more present, like a man who has been told the weather is changing and is watching the sky without saying so. He came to the kitchen island 3 nights in a row without asking for anything. Just sat there while she cleaned up, and each night they talked for a while about nothing urgent, about food, about Chicago, about the restaurant downstairs, and each night he left, when she started putting things away, like a man honoring a boundary he wasn't sure was his to cross. She noticed he had stopped using the taster for meals she handed him directly. She did not comment, but she noticed. On the 4th morning, she arrived at the kitchen at 6 and found an envelope on the counter with her name on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed from Victor Orlov's people, though it carried no signature and no return address. Lucas had intercepted it from the building's mail system and left it for her to find because he believed she had a right to know what was coming before it arrived. The letter said her father had been taken. It said she had 24 hours. It said 3 drops of a compound described in clinical odorless terms in Adrian Moretti's dinner, and Frank Bennett would be returned unharmed. It said if she contacted anyone, her father would not survive the conversation. Grace read the letter twice. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. Then she stood at the counter for exactly 4 minutes, she counted, because she needed to know she was still in control of time, and then she turned on the burner and began making breakfast. She could not call the police. The letter was explicit, and she believed it because the people who wrote it had already proven they could reach her inside a secured building. She could not tell Adrian directly because the moment she did, his response would be immediate and blunt, and the kind that moved faster than the information she needed where exactly her father was being held. She had one name: Warehouse. She had one demand: tonight's dinner. She had one choice that felt like no choice at all. She cooked breakfast. She served it. She heard Adrian eat. She cleaned up. Then she did what she had been doing since the beginning. She went through every delivery that arrived that morning, every crate, every container, every label. And in the third crate, tucked beneath a layer of fresh produce, as if it belonged there, she found a small glass vial sealed with black wax and wrapped in a piece of paper with 3 words written on it. 3 drops. Tonight. She held the vial in her palm and looked at it for a long time. She thought about Vivian, about an old woman sitting across from a 17-year-old girl in a Southside diner telling her she had good hands. About all the Tuesday mornings and the recipes and the stories Vivian had told her about cooking for people who were difficult and demanding and sometimes frightening because food, Vivian always said, doesn't care who you're feeding, you do. And the day you stop caring, you stop cooking and start performing. And performing is just lying with better presentation. Grace put the vial in her apron pocket beside the letter. She went back to the stove. She spent the morning cooking and thinking the way she always cooked, and thought simultaneously, fully, one informing the other. By early afternoon, she had arrived at the only position she could live with. She would not use the vial. She did not know yet exactly how she would handle what came after that decision, but the decision itself was made and solid, and she was done negotiating with it. The question was what to do in the space between now and dinner. She called Frank's cell phone at noon. No answer. She called twice more. Nothing. She stood in the kitchen holding her phone with both hands and breathed through the fear, the way Vivian had taught her to breathe through a difficult moment in the kitchen, steadily from the bottom. Because panic is just fear that's been allowed to run without a direction, and a direction is what you give it. She found her direction at 1:15 in the afternoon. She went to her spice box and took out Vivian's recipe book and opened it to the seafood section and read the margin notes again. But this time she read them looking for something specific. Not just the name Orlov, not just the description of the switched delivery crate and the broken seal, but the location details. Vivian had written with the precision of a woman who had understood even in that moment that details would matter later. She had written about the loading dock, the warehouse number, the street. The street was on the south side. The warehouse was a converted facility that had changed hands multiple times over 30 years, but buildings didn't move. Streets didn't move. And Victor Orlov Grace was beginning to understand was a man of deep habits who returned to the same infrastructure the way water returns to the same channels. She photographed the margin notes with her phone. She sent the photographs to one person, Lucas Shaw. She sent them with a single message. This is where they're keeping my father. I found a vial in this morning's delivery. I need you to know before tonight because I won't be using it, and whatever happens after that is going to happen fast. Lucas called back in 4 minutes. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that Grace had never heard from him before, something close to alarm. Grace, he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name. Does Mr. Moretti know? Not yet, she said. I need to tell him. I know, she said, but not until you've confirmed the location. If he moves before we know exactly where my father is, we lose the advantage. She paused. Can you do that? Can you verify the location without tipping anyone off? A long silence on the other end. She could hear him thinking, which was unusual for Lucas, who generally gave the impression that his thinking happened somewhere invisible and private and emerged already finished. "Give me 3 hours," he said. "You have 2, she said. "I start cooking dinner at 5. He hung up. Grace put down her phone and picked up her knife and began preparing the afternoon's mise en place because the knife work still needed to be done and the vegetables still needed to be cut, and the world, contrary to every instinct she had right now, had not actually stopped. At 3:47, Lucas texted her 2 words, "Location confirmed." At 4 o'clock, he appeared at the kitchen door. He looked at her for a moment before he said anything, the way you look at someone when you're adjusting what you know about them. "You were right about the warehouse," he said. "Same block as the coordinates in the book. Different tenant name, but same structure, same loading dock configuration." He paused. "My team can move on it. When, after dinner service, we move too early. Orlov's people inside the warehouse get a signal. We need him to believe everything is proceeding." He met her eyes. "Which means Adrian needs to sit down to dinner tonight not knowing the plan." Grace set down her knife. "You want me to serve him dinner and act like everything is normal?" "I want you to serve him dinner," Lucas said. "Everything else is your decision." She understood what he was not saying, that he was giving her the choice, which was more than Orlov had given her, and more than most people in her situation got. She also understood that he had not answered her earlier unasked question, which was whether he had told Adrian about the vial. "Does he know?" she said. Lucas said, "He knows you received a threat. He doesn't know the specifics." "Did he ask?" "He asked if you were safe." Grace was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were cooking," Lucas said. "He said that wasn't what he asked. I told him it was the best answer I had." She looked at Lucas and thought about the version of this story where everything went wrong, where the warehouse location was incorrect, where her father wasn't there, where she served the clean plate, and then the phone rang with news she couldn't unhear. She thought about it fully and completely, and then she set it aside the way you set aside a dish that didn't work, not with defeat, but with finality. She had made her decision. The decisions from here were Lucas's. "Go get your team ready," she said. "I'll handle dinner." He left. She began cooking at 5 o'clock precisely. Adrian's dinner that night was braised beef. His favorite, she had determined, over 2 weeks of careful observation. Not because he had ever said so, but because of the way he went still when she put it in front of him, the way his shoulders came down slightly, the way he ate it more slowly than anything else, as if he was trying to make it last. Braised beef with root vegetables and a simple sauce from the drippings bred a small green salad. Nothing complicated. Nothing that required pretense. The food of someone who trusted the person who made it. She cooked with the vial sitting in her apron pocket the whole time. She was aware of its weight, not heavy, barely anything but present, the way wrong things are always present. She could feel it against her hip each time she turned, each time she reached, each time she plated the bread or stirred the sauce. She thought about her father. Frank Bennett was not a perfect man. He had made bad choices and worse ones after that, and he had let his daughter carry consequences that were not hers to carry. And she loved him fully, and she was angry at him fully. And those two things existed in her simultaneously, without canceling each other out, the way Vivian had told her a really good dish holds two contrasting flavors, not blended together into something neutral, but distinct and present and honest. She plated the dinner at 6:58, braised beef gleaming and fragrant, bread on the side still warm, the sauce in a small pitcher not poured because Adrian liked to pour it himself, which she had also noticed without being told. She carried it to the dining room. Adrian was already at the table, which was unusual. He typically arrived after the plate, the way a man enters a room after making sure it's safe. Tonight he was sitting there when she came in upright, with his hands on the table and his eyes on the door. He watched her carry the plate across the room. She set it in front of him. She turned to leave. He said, "Grace." She stopped. Her back was to him. She stood very still. He said, "Sit down." She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, open, in a way that cost him something. The way openness always costs a man who has paid for it in the past and still reaches for it anyway. She sat down across the table from him without a plate, her hands in her lap. He looked at the food. He looked at her. "Lucas told me," he said. She waited. "Not everything," he said. "Enough." He looked at the plate again. "There's something in it. It was not a question, and she understood he was giving her the chance to say it herself, which was something she hadn't expected from him. No, she said. There was something I was told to put in it. I didn't. He held her gaze. Where is it? She reached into her apron pocket and placed the vial on the table between them. Small and glass and sealed with black wax sitting on the white tablecloth between the braised beef and the bread, like an impossible thing in a normal world. Adrian looked at it for a yang time, then he looked at her. You could have used it. Yes, she said, they have your father. Yes. And you still didn't. She looked at him steadily. I need you to understand something, she said. I need you to understand this clearly. She leaned forward slightly. I didn't refuse because I'm brave. I refused because I can't be the person who does this to another person, not even to save someone I love. Because if I become that, if I cross that, then whatever comes after, I'm not the same person who taught my father's daughter how to cook. I'm not the same person who carries Vivian's book. I'm something else. She paused. And I'm not willing to become something else. The room was very quiet. Adrian looked at her for so long that the silence became its own kind of conversation. Then he said in a voice that was quieter than she had ever heard from him, my mother used to say something like that, not those words, but the idea. He looked at the table. She said the person who does wrong to prevent wrong has only doubled the wrong in the world. Grace felt something shift in the room, not physically, in the weight of it, the texture. Your mother sounds like she was wise, she said. She was, he said. She was wiser than anyone who ever sat at her table. He looked at the vial, and someone killed her for it, or tried to. He paused. I've believed the wrong story for 15 years. She said nothing. She let the statement stand. The notes in the book, he said. I read the copies Lucas made. Vivian LeBlanc wrote a detailed account of what she saw that night. The switched crate, the broken seal. He stopped. A man named Orlov who had no reason to be in the kitchen. She never told me directly, Grace said. She told me the book was important. She made me promise to keep it safe. I think she was afraid if she told me everything, it would put me in danger. She paused. She was right, Adrian said very quietly. The poisoned dish was intended for my father, not my mother. Grace watched his face as he said it. She watched what it cost him to say it out loud in this room to another person. The way his jaw tightened once and then deliberately released. My father wasn't a good man, Adrian said. He was powerful and he was dangerous and he hurt people who couldn't defend themselves. Orlov had reasons. I'm not saying what he did was justified, but my mother died for a crime that wasn't aimed at her. And Vivian LeBlanc ran for 30 years from a blame she didn't earn. He stopped. And I spent 15 years believing she was a murderer. You believed what you were told by someone you trusted, Grace said. That's not the same as choosing to be wrong. He looked at her sharply. I'm not excusing the years, she said. I'm just being accurate about where the fault is. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling briefly the way people do when they need a moment that's larger than the room can provide. Then he looked at the plate. He picked up the bread. He poured the sauce from the small pitcher and Grace watched him do it. And it struck her fully in the chest that a man who had lived in the shadow of poison for 15 years was sitting across from her, eating the dinner she had been commanded to poison without a taster, without a physician, without any protection at all, except the word of a woman who had refused to do the thing she had been told to do. He ate, and then it happened. The recipe book fell from her apron pocket. She hadn't realized it was there. She had been carrying it all day without thinking the way you carry something you've been reaching for long enough that it becomes part of your body. It hit the floor and landed open, and Adrian looked down and she reached for it at the same moment he did, and for a second they were both looking at the same open page. The page with the seafood recipe, the margin notes, and at the top of the page in Vivian's handwriting, her full name, Vivian Marie LeBlanc, written with a care that suggested she knew someday it would matter that her name was legible. Adrian went very still. He looked at the name, he looked at Grace, he looked back at the name. Grace watched his face pass through something complicated and fast suspicion, calculation, pain, and she held her ground because she had been through enough in the past 24 hours to know that flinching now would cost her everything. You carried her name into my building, he said. His voice was controlled and careful, and she recognized the control as something he was working very hard to maintain. I carried her book, Grace said. I didn't know what it contained until I was already here. But you knew her name. I knew her as my teacher. I didn't know she was connected to your family until you told me about the banquet. He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her and she let him because some things need a moment of distance before they can be approached again. She said, Arian. He didn't turn around. I am not your enemy, she said. And neither was she. Read the notes again. Not as the man who was told she was guilty, as someone who is reading them for the first time. A long pause, long enough that she counted 30 seconds in her head. He turned around. Something in his face was different. Not soft. Adrian Moretti did not do soft, but something that was no longer locked. Lucas is moving on the warehouse, he said. Yes, she said. My father should have been the target, not my mother. Yes. And Orlov has been running from accountability for 30 years and decided to finish the job by using you. That's what Vivian's notes suggest, she said, and what your investigation has confirmed. He looked at her. You told Lucas before you told me. I needed the location confirmed before you acted, she said. If I told you first, you would have moved immediately, and we might have lost the chance to find my father alive. He was quiet for a moment. You made a tactical decision. I made the only decision that protected everyone, she said, including you. He sat back down. He picked up his fork, not because he was hungry, she thought, but because it was something to do with his hands. He said, when this is over. Yes. He looked at her directly. When this is over, I want to discuss what comes next. For both of us. Before she could respond, his phone rang. He answered it, listened, said nothing for 10 seconds, and then said, how many? He listened again. His jaw set. Don't let Orlov leave the building. I'm coming. He stood. He was already different, the man from the window, the one who had almost reached something real for a moment, folding back into the person who ran things and moved fast and didn't explain himself. He looked at Grace. Lucas found the warehouse, he said. Your father is there. They're moving now. Grace stood. I'm coming. No, he said. He's my father. And it's my operation, he said. And if something goes wrong, I need to know you're somewhere I can account for. She opened her mouth. He said, Grace, please. The word please from Adrian Moretti's mouth was so unexpected that it stopped her the way a loud noise stops you completely for 1 second. She sat back down. He left. The door closed behind him and Grace sat at the dining table with the empty plate and the bread and the small vial of poison still sitting on the white tablecloth. And she waited. She was not built for waiting. She had known this about herself her whole life. She was built for action, for the stove, for the moment when something needed to be done, and she was the one who would do it. Sitting still while something important happened somewhere she couldn't reach was the hardest thing she had ever done in a life that had not been short on difficulty. She picked up the recipe book from the floor where it had fallen. She sat at the table and held in both hands and thought about Vivian in a South Side apartment, writing notes in the margins of recipes, recording the truth of what she had witnessed and hiding it inside the one thing no one would ever think to look for: a cookbook. Not a testimony, not a letter, not a document anyone would call evidence. A cookbook. She thought about the patience that required, the faith that the right person would eventually sit down with it and read it carefully enough. She thought Vivian would have been exactly that patient. Vivian was the most patient person she had ever known. She had been teaching a teenager to make stock for 6 weeks before she let her touch anything else, and she had never once in all the years Grace had known her shown any sign that the waiting was costing her anything. She wore it like a coat she'd had long enough that it fit perfectly. You knew, Grace said quietly to the book to Vivian. You always knew someone would eventually put it together. She sat there for an hour and 40 minutes. She knew the exact time because she counted it the way she counted cooking times, not obsessively, but consistently, the way you track a thing that matters. At 9:17, her phone rang. Lucas's number. She answered before the first ring finished. Your father is safe, Lucas said. He's shaken but unharmed. We have him. Grace closed her. She let out a breath that she had been holding in some form since 6 o'clock that morning. And Orlov detained, Lucas said. Evidence secured. A pause. Mr. Moretti was injured. Her eyes opened. How badly? A cut on his side. He took a hit shielding one of the younger men on the team. He's stable. He's coming back. She stood up. She went to the kitchen. She turned on the burner. When Adrian came through the door at 10:45, Grace was at the stove and the kitchen was warm and there was a pot on the low flame that smelled like something honest and patient and deeply quietly good. He came in with his jacket gone and a bandage visible through the side of his shirt, and the expression of a man who has been through something hard and come out the other side, still standing, which is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't look like tiredness. It looks like weight. He stopped when he saw her. "You're still here," he said. "I told you I'd be here," she said. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen island. She brought him a bowl of the soup she had been making, simple, warm, nourishing, the kind of thing that doesn't pretend to be more than it is. She sat across from him. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. "You found out I was hurt, and you made soup." "I found out you were coming back, and I made soup," she said. "There's a difference." He picked up the spoon. He ate. She watched him, and she thought about Vivian and about her father and about a name written at the top of a recipe page in handwriting that had waited 30 years to be believed. She thought about all the things she still didn't know and all the things that still needed to be said, the conversations that were waiting on the other side of tonight like dishes she hadn't yet prepared. But right now, the soup was enough. And for the first time since the letter had appeared on the counter at 6 in the morning, Grace Bennett felt the stone in her chest begin slowly to lift. The soup was finished, the bowls were empty, the kitchen was the quietest it had been all night, and Adrian sat at the island with both hands wrapped around a glass of water, not drinking it, just holding it the way a person holds something when they need to feel that their hands still work. Grace cleaned the pot. She ran the water slow and quiet, not wanting to break the particular silence that had settled over the kitchen. Not awkward, not heavy, just the silence of two people who had been through something together and were still finding out what it meant. Adrian said, "Your father is being brought to a secure location tonight. Lucas will make sure he's comfortable." "Thank you," Grace said without turning around. "He'll need to be questioned about the debt, about Orlov's people, about what he knows." A pause. "I'll make sure it's handled with some decency." She turned around at that. "Some decency," she repeated. "As much as the situation allows," he said. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel and looked at him. He didn't know what he was setting in motion. "My father is not a complicated man. He borrows money from the wrong people because he can't stop himself from gambling, and he keeps thinking the next bet will fix everything the last one broke." She paused. "He didn't put me in danger on purpose. He put himself in danger, and I happened to be standing close enough to catch the blast." Adrian said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're defending him." "I'm describing him accurately," she said. "There's a difference." She put the towel down. "I can be angry at someone and still tell the truth about them. The two things don't cancel each other out." He looked at her with that steady measuring quality she had come to recognize as his version of paying full attention. "You do that a lot," he said. "Hold two things at once." "Vivian called it cooking with both hands," Grace said. "She said a real cook never puts one ingredient down to pick up another. You hold everything at the same time. You learn the weight of all of it." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was the most remarkable person I've ever known," Grace said. "And she spent 30 years of her life hiding from a lie she didn't tell." She looked at him. "That's what I can't let go of. Not the danger, not what happened tonight. The waste of it. 30 years of Vivian LeBlanc cooking in a small apartment on the south side when she should have been running a kitchen somewhere, teaching people, leaving a real legacy." She paused and her voice was steady, but only just. "She left a legacy anyway. She left it in me, but she deserved better," Adrian said very quietly. "Yes, she did." He said it without qualification, without deflection, and Grace understood that it was as close as he could come right now to acknowledging the full weight of what his family's belief in the wrong story had cost Vivian LeBlanc. She accepted it as what it was, incomplete, honest, the beginning of something rather than the end. She picked up her spice box from the counter and held it under her arm. "I'm going to check on my father in the morning," she said. "I'll be back for breakfast at 7. He looked at her. "You're still planning to come back?" "I made a commitment," she said. "I don't walk away from commitments because the circumstances got complicated." She was at the kitchen door when he said grace. The same way he'd said it at dinner with a weight to it, she was learning to recognize as the word he used when he had something to say that didn't come easily. She stopped. "I'm glad you didn't use it," he said. "The vial." She looked back at him. "I know," she said. "I could tell you were even when you were angry about everything else." She left. He sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after that, which Lucas noted on the security log and did not interrupt. Frank Bennett was a small man in a large chair when Grace saw him the following morning at 9 o'clock. He had been put up in a clean, secure room in a building. Lucas controlled, and he looked exactly like what he was, a 62-year-old man who had been frightened badly and hadn't slept and was sitting with the full weight of what he'd done pressing down on him from every direction. He looked up when Grace came in, and his face did something complicated and painful and very human. He said, "Gracie." She crossed the room and put her arms around him because he was her father and he was alive. And the alternative was a reality she was not willing to look at directly. She held him for a moment tight, and then she stepped back and sat down across from him, and she looked at him the way she had learned to look at things that mattered clearly, fully, without flinching. "Start from the beginning," she said, "all of it." He told her. It took 40 minutes, and there were parts where his voice broke, and parts where he couldn't look at her, and parts where she had to work hard at not letting her own feelings run ahead of the information, because she needed to hear all of it before she responded to any of it. The debt had started 4 years ago. A gambling operation connected, though Frank hadn't known it at the time, to Orlov's network. The losses had compounded, the interest had grown. When Frank had tried to pull back, the pressure had increased. He had been told 8 months ago that his debt could be forgiven in full if he could get his daughter hired at the Bellmont, if he could make sure she was in that building. Grace went very still. "You arranged it," she said. Frank looked at the table. "I didn't know what they wanted from you. I swear to God, Gracie, I thought they wanted someone on the inside, someone to pass information. I didn't know they were going to." He stopped. "I didn't know about any of this. You put me in position," she said, "without telling me, without asking me." "I know," he said. "I know what I did." The room was quiet. Grace sat with it. She sat with the full scope of it, that her presence at the Bellmont had not been accidental, that Dalton's illness had not been coincidental, that she had been moved like a piece on a board by a man she trusted more than almost anyone, who had done it out of desperation and love, and a complete failure to think past the immediate problem. She said, "You put Vivian's life's work in danger. The book, everything she trusted me to keep." He looked up. "I didn't know about any book." "No," Grace said. "You never knew about Vivian either. I never told you about her, because some things I kept for myself." She paused. That might be the only reason any of this resolved the way it did. He had no answer for that. She stood up. She stood at the window and looked out at the city and breathed bottom of the lungs the way Vivian had taught her. Steady, no panic, a direction. Then she turned around. "I'm not going to tell you I forgive you," she said. "Not today. Today I need you to listen to me very carefully." She held his eyes. "You are going to accept the help that's being offered. You're going to go into treatment for the gambling. Real treatment, residential, the kind that takes months and doesn't have a back door. You can walk out of when it gets hard. You're going to tell everything you know to Lucas's people honestly and completely, because the more information they have, the cleaner this whole situation gets resolved." She paused. "And you are never under any circumstances going to make a decision that involves me without asking me first. Do you understand?" Frank said, "Yes." "I need more than yes," she said. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way parents sometimes don't look at their children, because looking fully means seeing how much the child has become someone separate and complete. "You sound like your mother," he said, "when she was angry at me. That's same the way you hold yourself." Grace felt the comparison land, not harshly, but with real weight, because her mother had died when Grace was 9, and she had spent 22 years not knowing what she'd inherited from her. "Good," she said. "Then you know I mean what I say." She left him there with a promise to visit again that evening and went back to the building. She was back in the kitchen at 11:45, preparing Adrian's lunch, and she thought about her mother the whole time, and she thought about Vivian, and she thought about the line of women who had handed things forward, competence and love, and the refusal to be entirely erased, and she cooked with the awareness of that line running through her hands. Adrian ate lunch without comment. He was working through something himself, she could tell by the way he moved through the penthouse that day. The careful, deliberate quality of it, like a man picking his way through terrain that used to be familiar and has been recently rearranged. At 4 in the afternoon, he knocked on the kitchen door frame. She looked up from the prep she was doing for dinner. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Then talk," she said, and kept chopping. He came in and sat at the island and was quiet for long enough that she put down the knife and turned around because she had learned that his silences had different textures, and this one was the kind that required her full attention. He said, "I've been thinking about what happens after this. After this meeting, after Orlov," she said. "After all of it," he said. "I've spent 15 years running businesses that operate in the space between legal and not. I've spent 15 years being the kind of man that people in this city are afraid of." He paused. "And I've spent those 15 years eating alone." She said nothing. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it fully before you respond," he said. She nodded. He said, "You are the first person in a very long time who has made me feel like a human being sitting at a table rather than a threat to be managed or an authority to be deferred to. You did it with food and honesty and a complete refusal to pretend that I was something different from what I am." He stopped. "I'm aware that I'm dangerous to be near. I'm aware that the things I'm connected to put people at risk. Orlov is one example. He won't be the last." "Grace," said Adrian. "Let me finish," he said. He looked at his hands on the counter. "I want to give you your contract termination. Full pay for the remaining period, a strong reference, and legal documentation that keeps you clear of any of my business associations." He looked up. "And enough money to go somewhere and start what you should have started years ago. A restaurant. Your own. Under your name." Grace was very still. "There's a passport I'm having prepared," he said. "Clean documents, no strings. You could go anywhere. New York, San Francisco. Somewhere no one who knows my name will come looking for anyone connected to me." He paused. "You deserve a life that isn't standing next to mine." The kitchen was quiet. She looked at him for a long moment at the effort it had cost him to construct this speech and deliver it, at the particular kind of pain on the face of a man who is handing something away because he believes keeping it would damage it. She said, "You've done it again." He blinked. "Done what?" "Made a decision for Muam," she said. "Decided what's best for me, arranged the outcome in advance and presented it as a gift." She leaned forward slightly. "That's what powerful men do. They protect people by removing their choices. They call it generosity, and it looks like generosity, and it feels like generosity, and it is structurally exactly the same thing as control." He said nothing, but she could see it landing. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," she said, and she meant it fully. "I understand it comes from something real. But you don't get to imprison me, and you don't get to free me. Those are not your decisions to make." "I'm trying to protect you," he said. "I know," she said. "That's exactly the problem." He looked at her. "Then what do you want? Tell me, directly." She turned back to her prep and picked up the knife and began chopping again steadily because the movement helped her think, and she had learned not to apologize for that. "I want to decide for myself," she said. "Whether I stay or go, whether I start a restaurant or keep cooking privately, whether I stay near you or put 1,000 miles between us. Those are my decisions made with full information, made freely." She set the knife down once and looked at him. "I don't need your money to start something. I need the freedom to decide if that's what I'm starting." She picked up the knife again. "Give me the information. Give me the choice. And then step back and let me be a person, not a problem you solved." I was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What if you decide to stay?" "Then I stay," she said. "But as an equal, not your employee, not your dependent, not your protected asset." She chopped steadily. "If I'm here as a partner with authority over my kitchen and my work and my future." Another long silence. She let it go as long as it needed to. He said, "I accept that." She looked up. "You accept it, or you're agreeing because it's what I want to hear?" He almost smiled. She caught it same place she always caught it, just at the left corner of his mouth. "I accept it," he said. "The difference is real and you're right to demand it." She nodded once and went back to her work. He sat at the island for another half hour, not talking, not leaving, just present in the kitchen the way he had been present more and more over the past weeks. Not because he needed anything specific, but because the kitchen Grace had come to understand was the only place in the penthouse where he felt fully human. And that was Vivian's gift, reaching forward through Grace's hands. That evening, Grace cooked dinner, and then she went to her apartment, and she sat at her kitchen table with the passport she had been given. It was there when she returned, left on the counter with the contract termination papers and a bank document she didn't open, and she held it in both hands and thought. She thought for a long time. She was honest with herself about all of it, the way Vivian had always demanded honesty. Not the flattering kind, not the kind that becomes self-pity, but the plain, unadorned kind that tells you what you actually feel without the costume of what you think you're supposed to feel. She felt fear. She was afraid of what it meant to stay near a man whose world generated consequences like the past 2 weeks. She was afraid that the next crisis wouldn't resolve as cleanly, that the next threat would arrive from a direction she couldn't anticipate, that her father's situation would be repeated in some new form. She felt something else, too. She felt the particular clarity of a person who has discovered what they are capable of under pressure and found the answer to be more than they expected. She had walked into that kitchen on a stormy Tuesday night and cooked a bowl of oxtail stew that had reached something in a man nothing else had touched in 15 years. She had caught contaminated oil by smell alone. She had held a vial of poison in her apron pocket for 6 hours and not used it. She had sat across from the most frightening man in Chicago and told him he was wrong and he had listened. She was not a woman who needed saving. She was a woman who needed room. She left the passport on the table. She went back the next morning at 6 o'clock, same as always, and made breakfast at 7, same as always. Adrian came out at 7:22 and stopped when he saw the food on the table, and then he looked at the kitchen door where Grace was standing with her coffee, and he understood without a word being said. He sat down and ate. At 11 o'clock that morning, Frank Bennett called her from the treatment facility where Lucas had arranged placement. He had agreed to it. He sounded for the first time in years like a man who had stopped running from himself long enough to face the direction he needed to walk. I told them everything I know about Orlov's network, he said. All of it. Names, locations, the arrangement. Everything. A pause. The federal people were there too, Gracie. It's going to be a big thing. I know, she said. Are you safe? Yes, she said. Are you? A pause. I think I'm going to buy, he said. I think for the first time in a while, I think I'm actually going to be. She hung up and stood in the kitchen and let the relief of it move through her, clean and thorough like good stock, finishing the last of its reduction. All the uncertainty boiled away what remained pure and clear. 3 days later, Grace was cooking the late afternoon prep when Adrian appeared at the kitchen door. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was not sure how it would be received, which was unusual for him and which she had learned to take seriously. He said, the Bellmont reopens in 3 weeks. She looked up from her work. I know. The staff schedule was circulated yesterday. I want you to run it, he said. She set down the vegetable she was holding. Run it. Executive chef, full authority over the kitchen, the menu, the staff structure, complete creative control. He paused. Dalton is not returning. I've made that clear. She looked at him. You're offering me the restaurant. I'm offering you the position, he said carefully. The restaurant is the Bellmont. It belongs to itself. You'd be the person who runs its kitchen. She caught the distinction and appreciated it. And what does that look like structurally? What does my authority actually include? He listed it. Hiring and firing of kitchen staff. Final decision on menu and suppliers. Direct reporting relationship to him on budget, no intermediary. Her name on the door, not the restaurant's door, the kitchen door. A nameplate on the pass. She listened to all of it. Then she said, I want one more thing. Tell me. Monday nights, she said. The restaurant is closed to regular service on Monday nights. That time is mine. I use it for a training program. Women who've been overlooked by professional kitchens. Displaced workers. People with talent and no credential. Admission based on commitment, not background. She paused. The Bellmont funds the program. It's not charity, it's investment. He was quiet for a moment, then agreed. And Isabel Cruz gets promoted to sous chef on my first day. Done. And Vivian LeBlanc gets her name back, Grace said. A photograph at the kitchen entrance. A plaque. Her name, her contribution, and the acknowledgement that she was innocent. Not a footnote, something real. This one took longer. She could see him working through it, what it meant to publicly acknowledge what his family's belief had cost an innocent woman, what it said about the history of the restaurant, about the story he had inherited and maintained. She let him work through it because it was not a small thing and she was not going to pretend it was. He said yes. One word, solid. Then I accept, she said. She turned back to her prep. He stayed in the doorway another moment, then said, I also had the contract rewritten, the one you mentioned, equal partnership terms. She didn't look up. I know, I saw it on the counter this morning. You haven't signed it. I was waiting to finish this conversation first, she said. She paused, then looked at him. I'll sign it tonight. He nodded once and she could see what it meant to him. Not victory, not acquisition, something quieter and more durable than either. Something that a man who has spent 15 years eating alone does not have a ready vocabulary for, but recognizes when it arrives. He turned to leave. She said, Adrian. He looked back. What you did at the warehouse, she said, taking that hit for the younger man. Lucas told me. He shrugged, which was the most deflective gesture she had ever seen from him. He has children. You have responsibilities, she said. Powerful men generally prioritize their own survival. Powerful men, he said, generally eat alone. He paused. I'm trying something different. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was something between them that had no good name, yet something that would take time to become what it was going to be, but which was already there, already real, already growing in the quiet, particular way that real things grow. She said, go. I'll have dinner ready at 7. He went. She cooked. That evening after dinner was served and cleared, and the kitchen was clean, she sat at the island and opened the contract. She read every page slowly the way Vivian had taught her to read recipes, not looking for what she expected to find, but looking for what was actually there. It was what she had asked for. It was written exactly as discussed. Nothing hidden, nothing conditional, no language that gave with one hand and took with the other. She signed it and left it on the counter. Then she took out her phone and called Isabel Cruz, who answered on the second ring. Isabel, she said, it's Grace. I need you to clear your schedule for Monday morning. You're going to be training as sous chef, starting immediately. A pause. Also, do you know any women who have been trying to get into professional kitchens and keep hitting walls? A long pause on the other end. Then Isabel said slowly, I know about 12. Good day, Grace said. Make a list. Bring it Monday. She paused. We're going to open some doors. She hung up. She sat in the quiet kitchen with the signed contract in front of her and the spice box on the counter and Vivian's book inside it, and she felt the full weight of the moment settle around her, like something that had been looking for the right place to land and had finally found it. She was not the same woman who had folded a black apron on a kitchen counter 4 weeks ago. She was still Grace Bennett, still Frank's daughter, still the South Side girl who had learned to cook in a small apartment from the greatest teacher she would ever have. She was all of those things unchanged. But she was also now someone who had walked through a version of the impossible and come out the other side knowing exactly what she was made of. She turned off the kitchen light. She picked up her spice box. She took the elevator down and walked out into the Chicago night. And the city around her was the same city it had always been, complicated and beautiful and hard, and full of people who deserved better than the options they'd been handed. She was going to feed some of them. She was going to teach some of them. She was going to put a photograph of Vivian LeBlanc at the entrance of a kitchen that Vivian should have run and give her back the name that had been taken from her. And tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, she would come back to this building and turn on the burner and make breakfast for a man who had forgotten what it meant to be fed. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. The Bellmont reopened on a Thursday morning in early spring, and Grace Bennett arrived at 4:45 in the morning because she wanted to be there before anyone else. She wanted to stand in the kitchen alone for a few minutes in the quiet before the prep cooks arrived and the delivery started and the day became everything it was going to be. She wanted to stand there and feel the full weight of it without an audience. She stood at the pass, the long stainless steel counter where finished plates moved from the kitchen to the dining room, and she put both hands flat on the surface and breathed bottom of the lungs steady. The kitchen smelled of clean steel and possibility. It smelled like the beginning of something. On the wall to her left, at the entrance to the kitchen, was a wooden frame, simple and well-made, with a photograph inside it. The photograph was black and white, taken sometime in the late 1980s, and it showed a woman in her mid-30s standing at a stove with her back half turned to the camera, looking over her shoulder with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. It was the expression of a person who knows something the camera doesn't and is at peace with the difference. Vivian Marie LeBlanc. Below the photograph, a brass plaque. Grace had written the words herself, gone through 11 drafts, thrown away 10 of them, and kept the one that said what needed to be said without ornamentation. The plaque read Vivian Marie LeBlanc, 1951-2022, chef teacher and witness to truth. She cooked with honesty, taught with generosity, and carried her innocence with grace. This kitchen honors her name. Grace stood in front of it for a long moment. She had not cried when she wrote the words, and she did not cry now, because Vivian had specifically and repeatedly told her that sentiment in a kitchen was a distraction and tears belonged outside. But she pressed her fingertips lightly against the bottom edge of the frame, just for a second, in the way you touch something that matters more than you can say. "All right, Vivian," she said quietly, "let's cook." The first person to arrive after Grace was Isabel Cruz at 5:15, carrying a canvas bag full of knives and wearing the sous chef's uniform she had picked up from the locker room 2 days ago and clearly put on for the first time this morning because she was still adjusting to the fit of it, the collar, the way the jacket sat across her shoulders. She walked into the kitchen, saw Grace at the pass, and stopped. "You're here early," Isabel said. "I'm always here early," Grace said. "You should be too. That's one of the things about this job." Isabel came to stand beside her. She looked at Vivian's photograph. She had heard the story. Grace had told it to the kitchen staff at a full meeting the week before, all of it clearly and without softening any of the edges, and she had listened to it with the particular attention of someone who understands what it means to be a person the industry has decided isn't worth its full attention. "She looks like someone who knew what she was doing," Isabel said. "She was the best," Grace said. "Someday, if we do this right, someone is going to stand in this kitchen and say the same thing about you." Isabel looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she looked at Grace. "What do you need first?" "Stock," Grace said. "Beef and chicken. We're building from the bottom today. Every sauce, every base, everything from scratch. I want this kitchen to smell like it means it by the time the first ticket comes in." "Then let's start," Isabel said, and she walked to the prep station and began. The prep cooks arrived at 6, the line cooks at 6:30. By 7 o'clock, the kitchen had found its rhythm, and Grace moved through it the way she always moved through a kitchen. She trusted, unhurried but never slow, present in every section without hovering, the kind of leadership that feels less like authority and more like gravity. Things oriented toward her without being told to. At 8:15, Raymond Dalton arrived. This was not expected. Grace was at the sauce station when the door opened, and she heard the shift in the kitchen's energy before she turned around, that particular quality of hell breath that moves through a group of people when something uncomfortable enters the room. She turned and saw him standing just inside the kitchen door in his chef's whites, which he had no business wearing since he had no position here, and carrying a look on his face that Grace recognized as a man who had come prepared to be difficult. He had not resigned quietly. He had told anyone who would listen that Grace Bennett was unqualified, that her appointment was a manipulation, that Adrian Moretti had made a personal decision dressed up as a professional one. He had given 2 interviews to food industry publications, both of which had been careful enough legally to avoid specific allegations, but pointed enough in their implications that anyone who knew the Bellmont understood who was being discussed. Grace had read both interviews. She had not responded to either. He stood inside the kitchen door now and said, "I want to speak to you." The kitchen had gone as quiet as a kitchen full of people can go, which is not fully quiet, but is the particular quiet of many people who have suddenly become very interested in whatever is directly in front of them. Grace said, "This isn't a good time. Service prep ends at 9. "I'm not here about service," Dalton said. "I'm here because I have a proposal." Grace set down her spoon. She looked at him across the kitchen, the distance of maybe 20 feet, but the full weight of everything between them making it feel much larger. "All right," she said, "say it." He said it. He had thought it through, she could tell, because he delivered it with the precision of a man who has practiced. He proposed a blind cooking test. Same ingredients, same time, same kitchen. His food against hers, judged by the kitchen staff, anonymous. If she won, he would leave and never contest her authority again. If he won, he wanted his executive chef position reinstated and her role reclassified. The kitchen was very quiet. Grace looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the easy response, which was to decline and point out that she had no obligation to prove anything to a man who no longer worked here. She thought about the satisfying response, which was to accept immediately and aggressively. She thought about what Vivian would have done. Vivian would have asked one question before deciding anything. What does this actually cost, and what does it actually gain? Why said. Dalton blinked. Why what? Why this? Why now? You're not getting your position back, regardless of the outcome. Mr. Moretti has been clear on that, and this is his building. So what do you actually want from this? A pause. Some of the prepared speech left his face, and what was underneath it was more complicated and less certain. I want it on record, he said, that I was judged fairly. That whoever won on merit. Grace looked at him. She was looking at a man who was afraid that history would record him simply as the person who laughed at Grace Bennett on a stormy Tuesday night, and who was not wrong to be afraid of that because that was in fact what history was recording. She said, agreed, 1 hour, identical ingredients, staff judges blind. She paused. But I want to add one condition. He waited. The ingredients we use, she said, simple ones, nothing expensive, nothing that carries itself. Onion, carrots, celery, whatever protein is in the walk-in from today's delivery standard pantry. Nothing that does the work for you. Dalton said, fine. Isabel, Grace said without turning around. Yes, chef, Isabel said from across the kitchen. Set up 2 identical stations. Prep the same mise en place for each. Inform the staff that judging happens at 11. She turned back to Dalton. 1 hour. The test happened at 11 o'clock, and by 10:45, every person in the kitchen had found a reason to be present that had nothing to do with their actual station work, and Claudette had come down from the front of house, and 2 of the servers were standing near the pass trying to look casual. Grace noted all of it and said nothing because the attention of witnesses is not something she had ever been afraid of. Dalton cooked well. She watched him from the corner of her eye and acknowledged it honestly. The man had 30 years in professional kitchens, and he used them. His technique was clean and his timing was precise, and he cooked with the confidence of someone who has never had to wonder whether he belongs where he is. Grace cooked the way she always cooked. She made a braised chicken with root vegetables and a pan sauce built from the drippings rice on the side, simple green vegetables finished with good butter and salt. The kind of food that asked you to sit down and pay attention to it, not to be impressed by it. The plates were covered and numbered, not named. Every person on the kitchen staff tasted both and wrote their choice on a slip of paper. Isabel collected the slips and counted them at the prep counter with her back to the room. She turned around and said, Plate 1, 14 votes, plate 2, 3 votes. Which plate is which? Dalton said. Isabel looked at Grace. Grace nodded. Plate 1 is Grace's, Isabel said. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. 14-3. Not close. Not a matter of interpretation. Dalton stood at his station and looked at his plate. Grace watched his face do the thing that faces do when a person has been certain of something for a long time, and the certainty has just been publicly removed. It was not comfortable to watch. She did not look away. He said very quietly, how? It was not quite a question. Grace answered it anyway. I cooked for the person eating it, she said, not for the person watching me cook. She paused. Vivian taught me that years ago in a small apartment kitchen that didn't have half the equipment you've worked with your entire career. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked up at her. She must have been good. She was the best, Grace said, for the second time that day. Something moved through Dalton's expression. It was hard to name and didn't need to be. He untied his apron. He held it in both hands for a moment looking at it. Then he folded it once and placed it on the edge of the station, same as Grace had placed hers on a Tuesday night 4 weeks ago. He said, the kitchen is yours, Chef Bennett. He said it formally with the specific inflection of a professional, ceding professional ground, which was the most honest and difficult thing she had ever heard from him. She accepted it the same way. Thank you, Chef Dalton, she said. And she meant it because in that moment he had done the harder thing, and she recognized it. He left. The kitchen, after a brief collective exhale, went back to work. Grace returned to her station and picked up where she had left off because service was in 2 hours and the prep still needed finishing. Isabel appeared at her elbow. You okay? I'm fine, Grace said. Are the stocks ready? Both finished, Isabel said. Chicken is perfect. Beef needs 10 more minutes. Good, Grace said. Let's get to the sauces. The first Monday night training session happened 2 weeks after the Bellmont reopened. 12 women sat at the prep tables in the closed kitchen, and they were 12 different kinds of person, different ages, different backgrounds, different amounts of kitchen experience, some with none at all. What they shared was the particular look of people who have been told no in one form or another for long enough that they have started to believe it. Grace stood at the front of the kitchen and looked at all 12 of them and said, "I'm going to tell you something before we start. The person who taught me everything I know about cooking was a woman who spent 30 years hiding because the industry decided she was guilty of something she didn't do. She never had a restaurant. She never had a title. She cooked in a small apartment and she taught one student at a time, and she kept doing it because she believed that the right knowledge passed to the right person at the right moment can change the direction of a life." She paused. "That's what we're doing here. Every Monday night. This kitchen is yours." One of the women, older, maybe 60, with the hands of someone who had been working with them her whole life, said, "What do we start with?" "Knife skills," Grace said, "because everything starts there. And because a sharp knife in a confident hand is the most fundamental thing in a kitchen, and nobody gets to tell you your hand isn't good enough." They started. An hour into the session, the kitchen door opened and Adrian came in. He had not told her he would be there, and she had not asked him to come, which meant he had decided on his own, which meant something. He stood at the back of the kitchen and watched. He did not interrupt. He did not introduce himself. He just stood there watching 12 women learn to break down a whole chicken under Isabel's direction. And Grace watched him from the corner of her eye and saw his face doing the complicated private thing it did when something was reaching him in a place he hadn't expected to be reached. After the session ended and the women had gone, Isabel was cleaning the prep stations and Adrian came to stand beside Grace at the pass. He said, "How many do you think will actually make it into professional margins?" "Oh, all of them," Grace said. He looked at her. "That's not realistic." "Neither was me," she said. "And here we are." She looked at him. "You watch them and you see odds. I watch them and I see Vivian. Every single one of them could be someone's teacher someday. You don't know which one, so you treat all of them like the one." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to be very expensive to argue with." "Yes," she said, "I am. You should have factored that in before you signed the contract." He did the thing with the left corner of his mouth. She caught it. She always caught it. 3 months later, a food journalist from Chicago Magazine came to the Bellmont and spent a full service in the kitchen and wrote a long piece that ran on the cover. The headline read, "The Impossible Kitchen, How Grace Bennett Changed the Rules at the Bellmont." The article discussed the food in the Monday program and the brass plaque by the kitchen door and the name on it. The piece went wide. Not viral the way things go viral, but the slower, more durable kind of wide, shared by people who meant it passed between people in the industry who read it and felt something. Grace received 43 emails in the first week from women in kitchens across the country, from culinary students, from retired cooks who said they had almost given up on the industry before reading what she was building. She read every one and answered what she could. Adrian saw the article and said nothing for a day. Then he came to the kitchen and said, "The food journalist wants a follow-up piece about the business changes I'm making, the transition to legitimate investments." "I know," Grace said. "She emailed me." He paused. "She asked if you'd participate in the interview." "I know that too," Grace said. She looked at him. "Will you be honest in the interview about what the Bellmont was connected to and what it's becoming and why?" I was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Then yes," she said. "I'll participate." The interview ran a month later. It was not a comfortable piece for Adrian, and he had known it wouldn't be. He answered every question directly, and he did not use the interview to reconstruct himself as something easier than what he had been. He said at one point that the decision to change direction was not a sudden moral awakening. He said it was a gradual process, like changing the direction of a ship, slow, requiring constant correction, not finished. He said the person who had most clearly shown him the difference between control and protection was his executive chef, and that he was still learning what that difference looked like in practice. Grace, when asked what she wanted people to take from her story, thought about it for a long moment. The journalist waited, then Grace said, "I want people to understand that talent doesn't disappear just because nobody's looking at it. Vivian LeBlanc cooked extraordinary food in a small apartment for 30 years and the industry never knew her name. But she passed it forward. She passed it to me, and I'm passing it forward, and the women in my Monday kitchen are going to pass it forward again." She paused. What gets taken from a person isn't always gone. Sometimes it's just waiting for someone with enough stubbornness to carry it back. The journalist asked if she considered herself stubborn. Grace thought about a stormy Tuesday night in a bowl of oxtail stew and a man who hadn't finished a meal in 15 years. She thought about a black apron folded once and set on a counter. She thought about a vial of poison she had carried in her pocket for 6 hours and never opened. Extremely, she said. The last scene took place on a Monday night after the training session, after Isabel had gone home, and the prep women had gathered their things and the building was quiet. Grace was doing the final cleanup herself, same as always, because she had never been able to leave a kitchen dirty, and she never would. Adrian came in at 10 o'clock. He was learning her schedule the way she had learned his, not by being told, but by paying attention, which was the only way Grace had ever respected anything being learned. He sat at the kitchen island. She was finishing the last of the cleanup, wiping down the past with long, steady strokes. He said, "My people finalized the Orlov case this week. Federal prosecutors have everything. The trial is set for March." "I heard," she said. "He's going to prison," Adrian said. "For a long time, long enough." She stopped wiping. She looked at him. "How do you feel about that?" He thought about it. "Less than I expected to," he said. "I thought when it was finished I would feel something larger, some resolution." He paused. "Mostly I just feel like it's done. That's what justice usually feels like," she said. "Not triumphant, just finished." He looked at the photograph of Vivian on the wall across the kitchen. She deserved to see it. "Yes," Grace said, "she did." She came around the pass and sat on the stool across from him. But she knew it would come eventually. That's why she kept the book. She had enough patience to believe in eventually. He looked at her. "Did she teach you that too, the patience?" "She tried," Grace said. "I'm still working on it." A pause. "Ask me again in 10 years. I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that a commitment to still be here in 10 years? She looked at him directly. Not with coyness, not with deflection. The way she looked at everything that mattered. "It's a commitment to still be somewhere in 10 years, she said. "Somewhere that I chose. Doing work that I believe in, with people who respect what that means." She held his eyes. "Whether here or somewhere else is a decision I get to keep making. 1 year at a time." He nodded. "Fair." She stood up. She went to the stove. She turned on a low burner because there was broth left from the afternoon, and it had been simmering all evening, and she had been thinking about it for the last hour. She ladled 2 bowls of simple soup, the kind that doesn't have a recipe, the kind that comes from whatever is good and available, the kind Vivian used to make on Tuesday mornings when Grace came by before her diner shift, the kind that says, "I was thinking about you before you arrived." She placed 1 bowl in front of him. She sat across with her own. He picked up his spoon. He looked at the bowl. He looked at the empty kitchen around them. No guards, no taster, no physician waiting in the next room. No one between him and the food except the woman who made it. He looked at her. Is it good enough for the impossible man? It was the question she had been waiting for him to ask. Not because she had planned it, because some questions answer themselves when the time is right, and the time had been moving toward this moment since a stormy Tuesday night when a woman untied a black apron and refused to be laughed out of a kitchen. She looked at him, at the man who had not finished a meal in 15 years until she put a bowl of oxtail stew in front of him, at the man who had said please in a voice that surprised both of them, at the man who had walked into a warehouse to protect a young guard who had children, at the man who was sitting now without armor, in a kitchen that had finally learned how to be warm. She said, "Taste it and tell me." He brought the spoon to his mouth. He ate. He looked around the kitchen, at the clean steel, at the warm light, at Vivian's photograph, by the door at the 12 prep stations that would hold 12 women again next Monday, at the brass plaque that said her name like it had always been supposed to be there. He said, "It tastes like home." And that was the truth, and it was enough, and it was everything Vivian LeBlanc had always believed food could be: not a performance, not a luxury, not a weapon, not a test. Just the oldest human promise kept between 2 people across a kitchen counter. "I made this for you, and you are safe here, and you are not alone." That promise passed forward from a woman the world had tried to erase, had traveled through 30 years in 1 metal spice box and 1 pair of steady hands, and arrived exactly where it was always meant to go. And in the kitchen of the Bellmont on a quiet Monday night in Chicago, it was finally fully irrevocably home.